Good evening. My name is Antoinette. My pronouns are they and them, and I would love to welcome you to our final panel in our three-part series on addressing gender-based violence. We have with us the Reverend Ashely Horan from Side with Love, Reverend Latifa Griffin from a church in Florida. I think it's Palm Springs. Am I correct?
Palm Beach.
Palm Beach. And the Reverend Kimberly Johnson from New York. And what I'm gonna do is, Candace, if you would like to please screen share, that would be amazing.
Yes, I'm Candace. I'm one of the community organizers with Women's Federation. Thank you all so much for joining us. We have an amazing discussion ahead of you. Feel free, if you have any technological issues on your computer, feel free to chat with me in the chat. I'm going to be monitoring the chat and screen sharing, taking my screen off. So feel free to let me know if you all need any assistance with anything on your computers. And yes, I will screen share right now. How does it look? I'm not hearing it.
So I can see your whole screen, but also I can see the thing. So if you want it to just be the PowerPoint, I don't see just the PowerPoint, but you're probably good.
Okay. So can you see, you can't see it in full screen, is what you're saying?
Yes, I can't see it in full screen.
Okay.
It is customary for us to do a chalice lighting at the beginning of each of our gatherings. And so if you have a chalice near you, I invite you, once Candace screen shares, woohoo, there we go. Once Candace brings up our chalice lighting, which is the next slide, then many of you know Deanna, or Dee, who's a wonderful person in our UU community, and I found this chalice lighting that she said. We light this chalice, the symbol of our faith alive in this world, naming our vision of collective liberation and daring to remember each other into beloved community. And so I will bring into our conversation the lovely Reverend Horan and Reverend Kimberly. And I'll give each of our panelists and Reverend Griffin a chance to introduce themselves and the work that they do in and around the association or within their general community. So I will start with Reverend Kimberly, and then we'll pass it to Reverend Griffin, and then we'll pass it to Reverend Horan, and we can take down the slides.
Groovy. I'm Kimberly Johnson. I get to serve primarily as minister of a small congregation on the east end of Long Island, the South Fork. I also, in our faith, serve on the board of the Women's Federation, as well as the UU Service Committee and the Organizing Collective Board of Blue. and UU class conversations, which many people probably haven't heard of, but will probably come up later. I also, though, pre-ministry and continuing teach women and gender studies at a university in New Jersey. So that is a lot of what I do.
All right. So I am Reverend Latifa Griffin, and I am out of the First Unitarian Universalist Congregations of the Palm Beaches. I am originally from Philadelphia and did a lot of my internship and things in Philadelphia. I graduated from Lancaster Theological Seminary in 2021. So I also serve on the Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Board of Trustees. That's my thing. It's my jam, as Kiana Dene would say, who's also on the call. And I'm also a part of the UU Justice for the Middle East. I don't serve on the board in any capacity, but I am very active in that committee. So that's me. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm very new into ministry, and I'm excited to be here tonight.
Hey y'all, Ashely Horan, she, her pronouns, here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on Dakota and Anishinaabe lands, and delighted to be here with you all tonight. I serve as the organizing strategy director at the Unitarian Universalist Association, which means that I have the deep pleasure of leading the team that holds all of the outward facing social justice work of our faith through Side with Love and our related campaigns, which are, let's see if I can do them all four in a row, Create Climate Justice, UU the Vote, Uplift Action for LGBTQ, Gender, Reproductive, and Disability Justice, and our partner campaign with the UU Service Committee, Love Resists, which is about decriminalization. I've been a lot of places in Unitarian Universalism over the course of my life and career, and I get to interact with all of the organizations you all are naming tonight. Latifa, it's really nice to meet you in person. I've seen you out here on the internet, so good to be in person with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. It's been really amazing to bring in voices from across our association into this conversation of protecting women and gender expansive folks, which is the work that the UU Women's Federation does. As you may know, it is one of our priority issues, and we have four that intertwine in a variety of ways. What we used to call stopping domestic violence, we have upgraded to protecting women. This priority issue looks at keeping women safe, and it's explicit towards cis and trans women. What is not always as explicit is our commitment to include non-binary, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, gender expansive people. We try as often as possible to add it to our marketing and our social media. And this space today is part of the public question of who we include when we talk about us. And so the question that I have for our panel is, how can we be more inclusive in our actions, we being the Women's Federation, and in our language, and still stand firmly in prioritizing women as our focus? The second part of that question is, have you seen women's organizations do this well, and have you seen them do this poorly? And I will let who's ever feeling most called to start and kind of pass it around, because what's wonderful about this situation is that we can have a conversation with each other.
Well, I might start off because I think I would start off by talking a little bit about how the Women's Federation finds ourselves where we are. We actually spent over the past couple of years as a board really talking about what does it even mean to be a women's organization in this day and age as we complicate our understanding of gender. So for us, part of what that has meant is just being more expansive in our language and how we talk about who we are. Our name is still the Women's Federation, but in most of our material, we talk about femmes or people who are non-binary or people who are trans. I think in terms of, for me, and thinking about what that means practically speaking, it's helpful to think about not only people's identity, but people's experience. So I want to be attentive to people's experiences of being a woman, and that's not entirely about how one identifies, right? And usually when I'm thinking about people's experience, people are thinking of an experience of oppression, an experience of being oppressed as a woman. Yes, that. And also a lot of our experiences of being a woman or being femme are joyful and creative. So I'm also thinking about those other experiences of femininity or womanness or girlness. That's a tiny toe into this answer.
It would be helpful if you put the prompt in the comment box, in the chat box. But how can we be more inclusive in our actions and language? And have you seen other women groups do this well or poorly? I've seen it well in other professions. In my previous life, I used to be a city planner. And as a part of that job, we used to have to take requests for proposals or RFPs from groups, right, to do certain projects in and around the city. And sometimes we would happen upon women only planning groups or women only engineering groups. And what would set them apart is that they were women exclusively, and they would come in and advocate for themselves, and they would come in and explain to us why they wanted the job. And I thought that was exciting. And then once I got fast forward like 8 years, 10 years, I'm in ministry, and I see a lot of us. I see a lot of women, but not always in leadership positions or in positions of power. And that's across the board, right? Especially our trans siblings, right? So I think when we talk about language, when we talk about inclusivity, we have to include language. We have to include you know, we have to be okay with who they are, right? We don't need to pass judgment or anything like that. It is who they are. And I think that in the professional world, I've seen that done well. I don't know if I've seen that done well in ministry. I think we're trying to to make strides to be more inclusive to women that don't necessarily check the box as a cisgender woman. And I think we still have a little ways to go. And I'm a person that checks a box in that community. And so I do think we just have a long ways to go. So in the professional world, I've seen it done. In ministry, I think we have a little ways to go. I also think we have a longer ways to go in the professional world. So I'll leave it with that.
Oh, it's always best to go last when you're in the first round of a question. So I'm the lucky one here. Thank you, both of you, for those really thoughtful answers. The first thing that comes to mind is just like what used to serve as a shortcut, right? Women used to serve as sort of the shortcut for people who are directly and most directly impacted by patriarchy and misogyny. And I think we've gotten sharper about like what that means, right? So we actually know that everybody is impacted by that, in particular, people who aren't assigned male at birth, right? And I think we've gotten better at sort of like teasing out the many different things that have historically meant woman, as well as the broadening of that category now, right? And people for whom it is an important signifier, as well as people who just get lumped in that category because of how they present or how they are, right? So I think there is absolutely always usefulness in creating a space where people who are directly impacted by a particular system of oppression to be together and to both like affirm and nurture each other, but also to organize, right? Like to push back against it. So I think a space in which, you know, both cis women and trans women who identify strongly as women, but also non-binary and gender expansive folks who are directly targeted by patriarchy and misogyny, including, right, the subsets of that, which are homophobia and transphobia, which are direct outgrowths of those systems, right? I think it's really powerful to bring people together. And I think the work of the Women's Fed is like really important there. I believe that like caucus spaces, which I know the Women's Fed is not a caucus space, but the function of any sort of space where people are sharing a particular identity or experience, thank you, Kimberly, for that language. You know, I think those spaces can be really powerful when they are helping us to do the work in shared space that we then need to show up better in more diverse spaces where people share different identities. I also think that within that category of woman, right, all of the differences that we have in other pieces of our identity, right, race, class, you know, cisness or transness, et cetera, if you have an identifying category of woman, that can be sort of a place of shared experience and affirmation from which you can do some more intense work around places that women don't share all of those experiences, right? That they're impacted. It's a very different thing to be a white woman than it is to be a black trans, like a white cis woman than it is to be a black trans woman. There's certainly overlap, but like, I'm really appreciative for you all complicating the waters, right? And so I think both that offering of like, here is a clear mission, here's a clear set of people that we are working with. If you identify as a woman, you are welcome here, or this is who the focus of our work is, while also like not letting it be a turfy space, right? I'm sorry to use that acronym, but like a trans exclusive radical feminist space that's saying like women means this and it's determined by biology and all the things. I just went on a, like a wild rant of all of the things that I'm sure we will dig into more, but I'll stop there. So I think the inclusion is really about like in creating a space where people can opt in, making that space expansive, and also figuring out the nuances of what that space that is united by a particular identity or experience also complicates, you know.
Something else about that.
Yes.
I think part of why this is even a question is because there's a sense that there's only enough for some of us, right? There's only enough scholarships for some of us. There's only enough attention for some of us. There's only enough, whatever, freedom for some of us. Like freedom and opportunity and choices are not finite. There is enough for all of us. And part of why we get into this question is this idea that if I get something, then it will be at the expense of someone else, or more likely, if someone else gets something, it is at the expense of me, which really doesn't have to be true.
Mhm. Yes, I think that that really hits on something that's really important to think about, is that we as individuals can't fight away systematic issues, you know, and violence against women and gender expansive people is a systematic issue. So that relies heavily on the community work that we do and how we are building networks amongst each other. So that kind of leads us into our next question. And I'm going to direct it at Reverend Kimberly, since you were speaking last. And I think that it really speaks on like how are ways you have created in your ministry collective safety and security that everyone can feel a part of. And I'm going to drop that into the chat as well.
So I think the biggest way that I can think of is actually in work that was more addressed towards youth. So when I think of our safe congregations policies, for example, I have the most experience with those policies working with youth, but we also use them with adults. And so some of the principle around thinking about safe congregations is, I don't know, it's really straightforward, I think. How do we create spaces that are, how do we create spaces where we all get to be, where we all get to be safe, where we can let our children be safe, but some of what being attentive to safe congregations, I think, gives us is more thoughtfulness around the idea of boundaries and safety, and really more thoughtfulness and intention around how we balance our freedom against each other. In a conversation earlier today, somebody, and I don't remember what the conversation was, but somebody said something along the lines of, when my freedom starts to impinge on somebody else's, that's not freedom, that's oppression, right? And so safe congregations helps us think about freedom that is not only about me, but that is about creating spaces where everybody gets to be and express themselves. And while we think of them mostly in regards to children and youth, they are intended to be for all of us in a community.
And I just want to jump in on that, and speak from my experience a bit. Down here in Palm Beach in Florida, I don't have a safe congregations policy. I got here in August, and that's one of the things they didn't have. And one of the things they wanted to do was hang flags. Well, I'm a Black queer minister here in Florida. And if you're not privy to the politics here, this is a do not travel state for someone who checks the boxes that I check. So I shouldn't be here, let alone leading the church. So if I'm leading the church and we want to hang flags, well, a we need a policy and procedure to keep me, not only me safe, but the whole campus safe, right? So that's our conversation now. So it went from, oh, Reverend, we want to hang flags, to, wait a minute. If somebody comes and defaces these flags, or they want to come in on a Sunday morning and decide, hey, I want to shoot them up, because that's what happens in our society, right? What are we going to do? What's our response? We haven't even thought about it. So we need to have a conversation. So beyond women and trans women, there's just this issue of safety for folks, marginalized folks, folks in general, um, in certain spaces and places. So until we address that issue, we can't even talk about the minorities here, right? But because we're here, now we're talking about it here in Palm Beach, because I happen to check those boxes, and I care about those folks that those other marginalized folks that check the same boxes as I do, and keeping them safe here in Florida, a do not travel state for anybody in the LGBTQIA community. So it is my duty, right, to work hard to keep everybody safe, right? Not just the white man, the white woman, everybody. And that starts with a policy, and that starts with, having safe sanctuary policies. So when folks come in, we're able to keep them safe. But that's not an easy thing, because we're still working at it. We don't have a policy instituted right now.
Thank you for all of that. I'm coming right out of a weekend of hosting a conference with parts of the UUA about supporting congregations who are facing threats from either within or from, like white nationalist groups that are showing up at our congregations more and more frequently right now, right? So my perspective is sitting in a national role where I'm seeing patterns across the country, and we're working in relationship not only with our own congregations, but also with movement organizations and grassroots organizations that are responding to some of the ways that entire communities of people across the country are less and less safe right now. So concretely, what this looks like in our ministry over at Side with Love is things like we're teaching organizing skills to congregations and teams, like things like how to do a risk discernment in your congregation. What are the risks, like exactly like what Reverend Latifa was just talking about, like what kind of risks are we facing if we are doing public facing ministry? How can we push the boundaries of our courage while also keeping our members safe? What is our role? How can we say yes and no in an accountable way? We're also talking a lot about things like asset mapping and community resource and like community relationship mapping, right? So not only are we looking and seeing what are the things that are already in place in our congregations that will help us show up in useful ways out in the world, in our communities and in movements, but also like, who are our friends? Who do we know? Who's going to like show up in solidarity with us, and who needs us to show up well in solidarity with them? So, you know, some of the very basic things of organizing are just about how do we keep each other safe when the systems that were intentionally designed to keep small segments of the population safe are not actually working for everybody. We're also doing a lot of work specifically around stuff that intersects directly with gender. So we are actively helping to move trans folks, whether it's to cross state lines to access gender affirming care and or abortion. Right now, we're actively involved in like direct support networks for folks who are needing to leave where they are to get the healthcare they need, or because they are no longer safe and they have a certain degree of privilege that allows them to move to somewhere else where they feel more safe. We're also, of course, organizing and fighting a lot of the like legislation that's happening, the like legal battles that are happening in states. So what does it look like when we're prioritizing collective safety and security? Is like basically everything we're doing is trying to do that right now. We're in a political moment where we are not having big wins, right? This is not a moment when we are seeing huge advances in equity and equality for marginalized groups of people. This is a time when we're doing harm reduction. And, as the healing justice movement teaches us, you can't begin to heal until you stop the harm. And right now, that primary work is around harm reduction.
Yeah, thank you. I think that actually, can we talk a little bit more about that piece of it? The harm reduction, the ways in which we are being attacked, both physically and I would say mentally terrorized in our congregations, in ways that even if they're not things that y'all are doing in your specific congregations or roles that you've seen that we can take back into our communities, to sort of magnify this harm reduction piece. Are there pieces that you can talk to about that?
I mean, I think we could. I think in most congregations, there's some sort of adult spiritual development, or if they're calling it RE or something like that, where there could be classes about harm reduction and how we can reduce impact, or even teach about consent and teach about things that we find in our communities that are slipping through the cracks, right? I think that's part of our duties as ministers and our duties as educators, right? Because that's essentially what we are, right? If we're preaching, we need to be teaching those similar things. And so I think that if harm reduction is an issue in our communities, I think we need, if harm is an issue in our communities, right? If people are being impacted in that way, then harm reduction needs to be programming in and on our, in our communities, especially from us. But if we can't do it, we need to, support other avenues that are doing it, so that we can, help the larger community, the wider community. Because without that, I mean, our work is pointless. They may not be used, but we can certainly help lessen the impact.
I would just add that, like, I think most people think about harm reduction as like needle exchanges and Narcan, but mutual aid is a radical form of harm reduction, right? And for Unitarian Universalists, most of whom, not everybody, but the ethos, the culture is individualist. It's middle to upper middle class. It is well educated. It is nuclear family structure. Many of our people don't have an ethic of mutual aid as a part of their lived experience, right? And so honestly, we need to be teaching people, like, theologically what it is interdependence, right? And then practically what it is sharing our resources. And I'm beginning to see more and more of our folks kind of catching on to that in congregations. So like, instead of having year-long processes and congregational votes about whether we can move $1,000 to whatever organization is doing that direct work right now, right? Like, sometimes our very structures have been set up so that we can't help people, like either internally or externally. But watching folks move into new formations right now, where, like, I had an experience of working with a partner organization who was relocating a trans person to Minneapolis, and they needed $500 for grocery cards. And I did like a little crowdfund on my page and got $2,500 in, like, a day. And I was then able to magnify that and like help out 3 other folks who also needed help in their own processes. So like, I think most people don't get that sometimes that one-to-one, that like little bit of giving, that little bit of moving resources and being ready to, instead of just like thoughts and prayers, people be like, actually, we can help, right? Like, here are some concrete resources that my friends, my block, my community, my congregation can have. I would say that people who look like me and have a class and race experience like me don't always have that in our bones in the way that other communities do.
I think some of what harm reduction looks like in our congregations also is shifting the culture so that we talk about violence, talk about root causes of violence, and also, so I think both of you sort of alluded to it, but I want to say more explicitly, we often talk about violence as if it is a thing that happens to other people, not us. I think a culture of openness about talking about violence also needs to acknowledge that violence is happening in our congregations. It's happening to people in our congregations, right? And so the more that we can create a space where that is okay to say out loud, I think we move towards, I don't know, we move towards harm reduction, we move towards, I don't know what we move towards. We move towards something better.
Can't heal something you can't see, right? So it like demystifies and makes it open for intervention.
And just also big plug for OWL, which again, most people associate with that middle school age. Our whole lives really is meant to be talking about not just sexuality, but also autonomy, and addresses the ways that violence shows up and ways that we can prevent violence in our bodies and our language and our cultures throughout all of our lives, from as young as K1, kindergarten, first grade, into older adulthood.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of data points that we have. 2019 data from the World Health Organization shows that here in the US, 38% of women experience intimate partner violence or abuse. We know that the pandemic made that worse, and it kind of secluded women with their abusers when the world shut down. This data also shows that the more we start teaching young men and boys about the relationship with women, the better we have to kind of reduce this violence at a young age. And so the question I have is, do you see this change happening in your cultural spaces as opposed to 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Do you kind of see the work that we're doing paying off?
Antoinette, I can't speak to Florida. I just got here a few months ago, but I can speak to Philadelphia, in that area, where I served as a therapist for the past 10 years, as well as a minister. And I saw more and more young men coming into therapy. And my goal with them was to get them to talk about their feelings, because some of the conditioning that they've gotten in society, environmental conditioning, right? Because their parents are telling them to talk about this stuff, right? But only with them, not with their friends, because their friends don't think it's cool. But environmental society is telling them that it's not okay to talk about their emotions and to be vulnerable. And that's a problem. And we see that show up because now they don't know how to deal with these emotions that show up, and they take it out on the person closest to them, which happens to be their girlfriends or the person that they're living with. And that's unfortunate, especially when you're young and you don't have any control of your emotions. So it's an educational piece, right? And I know culturally in the African American community, we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it at all. And we're now starting to do a little bit more about it. But I've been a therapist in the African American community for 12 years in the Philadelphia area. And they only came when they were mandated mostly. Um, or young enough to be in the system to be mandated. But that wasn't my caseload. My caseload looked like, working the working well, the worried well. So when we talk about, this intimate partner violence, right? There's an educational piece that's missing because men aren't taught to go to therapy. Men aren't taught to go and get some help for their feelings and their emotions and to talk about these things that they're feeling. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel angry. It's not okay to act on it, right? And so if we do more with that, right, maybe we need a more spiritual development, adult spiritual development around that piece. Maybe we can help in terms of the UU piece. But as a therapist, a licensed therapist, my piece is always go see a therapist and talk about it. Because you're not going to be able to punch it out of somebody. It's not going to work. You're going to go to jail and you're going to lose your life. And spiritually, you can't get to that piece until you address the emotional piece. And that's just my belief. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll let someone else.
I think it's really helpful to also think about that violence is so much more than just interpersonal, and that it's so much more than somebody getting smacked or kicked or punched, right? There's so many forms of violence that can happen, unfortunately. The work of Insight, if you're familiar with them, Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, their mission is, they call themselves a radical network, a network of radical feminists of color organizing to end state violence and violence in our homes and communities, right? So they do a really explicit connection between those things and understand that we can't actually target those, we can't target one without the other, right? So in my work in like movement spaces and right, there's this sense in like lefty culture that there's never gonna, nobody in this community is ever gonna perpetrate violence against each other, and it happens all the time. And because of both the social overlay of like shame and stigma around that stuff, along with this sort of holier than thou posture that sometimes we have, there's this sense that like it's only out there, as Kimberly said, right? So I think in our congregations, working really hard to help people understand the connections between the systemic and the individual is huge. And I think that can happen through OWL, through your preaching, through the, like Reverend Latifa said, your adult education, all those sorts of things. I think it can help when, as religious professionals, often we're the first responders when somebody comes to us with a particular thing that's happening in their lives. So whether it's referring to a therapist who has a specialization in this, providing some, limited counseling within our resources, et cetera. The other thing I would say is just like, I think that we have shifted in some ways to understanding that it is part of, particularly for religious professionals and clergy, it is part of the formation that we have, right? So in the same way that teaching young boys from a young age about this stuff teaching clergy from the first time we enter seminary around what sexual misconduct looks like, what bullying can look like, what and the ways that those, if almost all of us if we serve in congregational ministries in what we call after pastor congregations, there's almost always some misconduct that has happened on some level in a congregation. And so I think we can think not just about children, but about like, if we are doing human formation with people as adults, as professionals who are coming into particular career paths, like the fact that I had to take a sexual boundaries class from like the moment I entered seminary is huge. And that is something that absolutely the generation of ministers before me didn't have in the same way.
And not just sexual misconduct, but regular old abuse of power, right? Like regular old abuse of power is a form of violence. And we don't talk enough about power and how we use it responsibly.
Yes, thank you all so much for those answers. And that leads us right into our next question. I know we've been talking a lot about harm and how we can bridge the gap into what we can do to heal ourselves. And so I kind of want to ask a little about what are your personal visions of care look like for yourself in this world of care? And what are some of your visions for the future and how we can really take care of ourselves as we go through this path of empowering those around us? Like, how can we pour from our own glass? So, and I'm going to direct that question to Reverend Kimberly.
Yes, why did you pick it on me?
It's all love. It's love.
Well, funny you should say that, because when I think about sort of what care looks like for me and an ethos of care, I do turn over and over and over again to Bell Hooks and her work on love. Because what she reminds me, and hopefully us, one of the things that's really powerful about the way that she talks about love is that we have to love ourselves. And there's a quote on my email this month, and it's actually not Bell Hooks. It's but I'm going to find it because it is
The Audre Lorde quote about radical acts of self-care.
no, it's my Angelou quote. He says, "I don't trust people who don't love themselves and tell me I love you." There's an African saying, which is, "Be careful when a naked person offers you a shirt." You cannot claim to love somebody if you don't not only don't know how to love yourself, but then don't actually do it. So that is part of what I think about when I think about love, but also so much of what Bell Hooks talks about is love as. So I was trying to think earlier today about the difference between love and violence, and I was centering on power. And one of the things that struck me is that violence is about like a will to exert power over. Whereas love is not just a will to exert power with, but it really is a will to give power to. It's like the exact opposite. And Hooks talks so much about there's no room for violence in love, right? If I want to love my beloved, then I want to give them power to do with as they will. So for me, what care looks like is really leaning into love for myself and others. But like real love, not just like feeling love.
That's a whole word right there. That's the sermon I need. I'll make it real granular. I'm in a queer relationship with a non-binary Black person who is assigned female at birth, and I am parenting small multiracial children while also taking care of parents who are aging and working a full-time job. So that's just some information about like the location that I am in. There's absolutely ways in which sexism and misogyny shows up in my own relationship. A lot of folks think that that is done when it's outside of the queer community. Spoiler alert, it's not. So, there's some stuff that is about just like creating the avenues of communication and support in my own house that are the things that I'm trying to create out in the world, right? So I'm sort of in a microcosm of what you're talking about, Kimberly, is like, I can't be out here talking about advocating for all this stuff, doing social justice out in the movement, if I'm not feeling that we are in a dynamic relationship of care together in my house. I'm parenting small children, and it looks like teaching them practices that are different from the ones that I inherited in many ways, when it comes to their own sense of self, their own sense of like what they deserve in terms of rest and nurturing and care. I think also just there's a tendency in the culture right now to really individualize self-care, right? Like there's a whole self-care industry that exists. And I think that can also put the blame back on individuals when really what we're talking about is like systemic problems, right? Like go take a bath and all of a sudden, capitalism will have ended. Untrue. So finding ways to create micro networks where we're living in a different way. So I have a group of friends with whom we step in and provide childcare for each other on the regular. I've got a group of people who, my femme clergy collective, who we show up and have breakfast once a week. And we keep that time that our jobs can't get to us. So little tiny ways of like practicing connection and mutuality and shared support is often what care looks like in my life.
I am eating, but I will respond. So care, it looks a little different for me because I've been struggling with this whole idea of loving your neighbor and loving your neighbor when your neighbor looks different than you or subscribe to different things than you, like, such as a pedophile. And so my visions for the future is, what does that look like? What does it look like to love someone that I hate or someone that I would, not like if I knew of their behaviors, right? So care of the world really means, for me, how do we work to repair some of the harm that's been done and love those people beyond their behaviors and moving beyond that? And I think we can really, as a society, move forward. And even as something extreme as the pedophile, if we can find forgiveness for them, then I think our future might be a little brighter, right? Um, so that's just, that's my thoughts on that. And I am caring for myself, Candace, right now by eating. Thank you. My sister brought in my food. It's been a long day.
Yeah, thank you. I think that it's the care that we give ourselves individually, take the moment, and then also that community care. I love how each of you were like, we do self-care, but we want to say that it's the communal care that's the piece. Like, I love how when people talk about self-care now, it's the like, not that bubble bath stuff that y'all think is self-care, but it's the actual community care that we bring. I love that you go to breakfast with a group of people every week. Like, that's amazing. I need to put that on my list of things to do. It sounds amazing.
Literal salvation, friends.
Well, we want to give space to let people who are not us, other people in the room, to ask questions that they may have been holding on to for a little bit of time. And so we'll open it up. The best way to do this is to use the raise hand function so that we can see people's hands. It's a little harder if you're kind of waving in your Zoom window, but I'm sure we can find you. And we can also answer questions that are put in the chat. So I'm happy to take anyone's raised hands, drop questions in the chat, and we'll give you the space to unmute yourself and ask our panelists some questions. Okay, Stephanie.
Hi. So actually I went to like a Days of Dialogue, I think last weekend. And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. And we talked about how, you know, the tapes that were released here in LA that were racist, and how, you know, these people are people of color, and how the power structure, the system gets perpetuated again and again. And so, yeah, removing them of office, you know, sounds good in theory, feels good, right? If we can get them out. But the reality is that sometimes they get replaced by somebody just as that does this, that will end up doing the same thing, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so, like, how do we push for like a political system that has like a restorative justice component to it? Because clearly what we've been doing, or just removing them out of office, isn't the solution if they're going to have a PR system with a ton of money to repair their I don't know, their stance in society.
Stephanie, can I give a little bit of context to your question and your location?
Yeah.
So Stephanie, who I know personally, lives in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles just went through the year-long struggle of watching our council members get caught saying racist things on tape, and then they get voted out, and then their protege gets voted back in. And so after a while, it's really hard to feel like we're making any kind of difference if the same type of people are the people that are getting elected, and it's still not safe for us to like exist in Los Angeles in particular. So
I think a little bit well, I'm finding an answer in your question itself, because I was first thinking, oh, what seems helpful is to not get sort of lured into a cult of charismatic personality, right? Where we're focusing on individuals and what individuals can do. I think I'm great at what I do, and it's not a great idea for my congregation, for example, to rely on my personality and my goodwill without actual systems of accountability. And so restorative justice actually are systems of account when it's like done well. It's not just removing a person, it is actually holding a person to account, right? So because when you just replace a person and replace them with something else, we don't actually get to any of the root of what's going on, right? There's not actual any accountability. You just like remove a person. And so restorative justice, I think, actually gets at the accountability in that issue, which is what I think gets us a little bit closer to, I think, what you're talking about, Stephanie. I remember when the tapes first came out. So it's interesting to hear that this is where it has landed.
I see we have a question in the chat. I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that question from Stephanie. If not, I want to make sure I highlight the question in the chat. Okay, so Caroline asks, I'm curious about adult owl and how that might help congregations aside from just sex education. Who has experience with this? So it might be a question to anyone on the call, I believe, who might have experience with adult owl.
Yeah, I can just say a little bit. I work with the folks on the OWL team here at the UUA who create that curriculum, and they're great. I think adult OWL is excellent for any number of reasons. One is that like stuff changes, it turns out, over time. Our understandings of gender and safest sexual practices and terminology and all that kind of stuff, just like it shifts and changes over time. And so like, who doesn't need a little refresh every once in a while as a grown-up? Also, I think their congregations benefit when there is a culture of being able to talk about intimate issues, including sexuality, gender, families, etc. And so in congregations where this is a regular practice, there's I've heard folks talk about like a decrease in stigma and shame around just like bringing our full selves into the congregation, which does include, our sexual lives, and all of the things, all is not just about like sex ed, it's about a full range of things that include sexuality and gender. Finally, I would just say that like, the congregation is just a healthier place when you've got the ability to just speak freely about this stuff. And there are, OWL does such a good job at equipping people to be clear and direct about sexuality. But gosh, it turns out that that is a replicable skill about so many other things, right? So like, if you can talk directly about like, oh, now I'm in menopause, maybe I didn't learn about what my body was going to feel like in menopause when I was in 9th grade OWL, but now I'm learning about this now, and now I can speak about it. Then it turns out maybe I have more boldness and courage and ability to speak out about other things in my life, in the congregation's life, etc. I'm not in a congregation though, so maybe y'all who are in one can talk about what you've actually seen up close and personal.
No, I appreciate what you said. I actually haven't seen, I have not ever experienced adult owl. I haven't seen it run. I'm eager to see. Maybe we'll do it out here on Long Island. But I would also say, so like, yes, exactly. In addition to me being able to talk more openly about my menopausal body, I think when it's a thing that we can talk about, not a lot of taboo, maybe also there's more empathy for all of the things that bodies are doing.
Yeah, I haven't had an experience with adult owl.
It seems like there's a large group of people who are at least interested in it. And so maybe we can find ways to connect.
We might have to get it going. All right, Reverend
Yeah.
Kimberly, I'm about to call you up. Get started.
I would totally
I
be
would just add that to my list of things.
All right, cool.
well, the nice thing about Women's Federation, if we all want to sit around and talk about menopause, then fine, we'll just have another Zoom about it. But I think that
That's funny.
I mean, who's going to stop us? And Reverend Ashely, you made a point to this earlier that Women's Federation is not caucus space, but we kind of are. Like, we are kind of pushing for the ways in which we can connect to each other through our shared experiences. And I think that the ways in which our bodies change, at least something that I've learned at my age so far, is that we definitely stopped talking about it. And I wish that we spent more time at least addressing those kinds of things and the ways in which our bodies will change and grow and things. That makes me think of a question that we asked in a previous panel And if no one else has their hand up or anything, one thing that we didn't talk about in this panel, but we talked about extensively in the last one, was the decentering of men and how that is coming across in our lives. I'm a person who is on TikTok a lot. And so a lot of the social media content that I see is ways in which people are decentering men. And people ask us at Women's Federation, like, who gets to come and who gets to participate? And most of the time, the answer is not men. And so how does that, I guess, how are you seeing that? Is that I don't want to say a good thing, because that is the thing that we're doing, but how can we approach decentering men in a way that is not just throwing them away, I guess? Maybe the question.
Well, I don't think you've thrown them away. I think they've been at the center and the forefront for so long, for centuries, right? That women need to create space and place for themselves. Unfortunately, it's come to that since we haven't done well at integrating. They don't necessarily want us in the spaces and places, so we have to create our own, and that's okay. And so we create our own with the intent, with our intent of our own objectives, right? And so whatever it is that we're trying to push forward, I think we can do it, with collective women power. We're not inept, and we're not less than. There's none of that. So I think we've had to do this because we just, men haven't been as inclusive as we've thought they should have been, over society. So I think that this is just where we're at, and this is what it is. So I'm excited about it.
My initial thought was, are we decentering men? I'm not sure that we are. And I think that what I'm reacting to is we might be decentering men. I don't think we're decentering patriarchy or dominance. And I don't think until we decenter patriarchy and dominance, that decentering just men is going to be particularly helpful or systemically helpful.
Yes, because patriarchy's answer is, there's only so much power in the pie, or pie in the power. And like, if somebody else has a slice of it, I don't get that slice. And so the decentering of men without actually dealing with patriarchy is going to end up with actually more violence, increased backlash, which is in fact what we're seeing nationwide right now, right? Like, fascism is all about masculinity reacting to some shit. That's all I'm gonna say. The other thing I'll say is, like, I have the privilege of working on a work team where there's only one of the 12 of us who is assigned male at birth. We are 85% queer, 70% trans or non-binary. Like, it's like a team in which you could not have fewer people who present sort of cis maleness. And what happens in that space, when, like, I think we've all experienced this in some way in our life, is like, when you are in a space where sort of everybody's own cultural, social, practical orientation is different than kind of what the dominant culture is, right? Like, I think we've all felt this if we're in like an all female space, or in a regional space, right? Like, I'm with Midwesterners and I'm gonna like jive with the Midwesterners, right? There are cultural shifts that can happen when you have a group of people who share a particular identity like that. And so I think, like, again, these women's spaces or not men's spaces can be super important in that way, because when you give people the ability to exist and to practice enough what it feels like to be outside of the sort of like the clutch of maleness and patriarchy within us, even a small space, like, we develop muscle memory. We're able to like carry that outside and do that work of beginning to actually attack patriarchy that is so essential.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. I see that Marta has her hand up. You're muted.
As a professional trainer, one of the things I taught people is that extremes are seldom good. And I use the analogy of a pendulum in a grandfather clock, that if the pendulum is way over here, it doesn't stay there. But if you let it go, it swings to the other side, but it ultimately reaches a middle ground. And I think that's where we are, or what we need to think of with the patriarchy, with men being frustrated with our letting it swing to the other side. But if we keep doing that, ultimately, I believe we will get where we need to be, of equality and justice for both, for all.
Thank you. Barb, you have your hand up.
Yeah, and I'll kind of ask or make a comment that I made last week, because I'm absolutely an advocate for those affinity groups, women only or LGBTQ, or however we're defining ourselves if we're oppressed. I do have a concern in the discussion of an issue like violence against women or trans or LGBTQ people, that the men are not having a parallel conversation. And I think part of why changes haven't occurred, and I think this goes to race issues too, if you do not have the oppressors, and I'm talking about the men who aren't the oppressors, actually taking the lead on why aren't adult men in our churches taking the lead on educating young men? Why aren't in the community violence against women and other people is seen as a women's issue or an LGBTQ issue, and we're just supposed to go out and solve it? Well, we can't solve it. And so even those men who are our allies and who understand it, I don't see them taking that responsibility. And I don't think we should therefore make our groups, we shouldn't invite men in to meet with us here, for example, necessarily. But somehow, what do we do to get that shift in who's responsible for that? And, I'm saying this as a 75-year-old woman who's been involved with women's groups for more than 50 years. We're still talking about the same issues, and we're losing ground in so many areas. Abortion still seen as a women's issue. That's insane.
I think there's always a question about whether a caucus space primarily serves as a refuge or as a safe place to be challenged. So in congregations where there are women's groups and men's groups, and there's some sort of relationship of accountability, right? So I know of a couple of congregations where the men's group was created in response to women in the congregation saying, we need you to work on some stuff. And that there is some sort of relationship between what happens in that men's group. So it's not just well, we're not going to piss off the ladies, but it's more about how are we actually deconstructing patriarchy within ourselves? There are definitely some folks out there who do that work, right? Cis men who are let's talk with other cis men about that and how we deconstruct and decolonize. But yeah, I mean, I think it absolutely men have to do that work, and power concedes nothing without some pressure. So I think there's absolutely we should be working for ways for men to have those spaces, and also it's not going to just evolve on its own.
It's good to hear, though, that there are men's spaces at churches that are doing that work. I am surprised. I know that there are men's spaces, but it sometimes is more of a refuge than an ally space. But to talk about those two different things, I mean, I think that Women's Federation is trying to hold both of those things at the same time. And the question is, can we? do both of those things? Can we be that refuge, and can we be that way to educate the outside world in a way that matters? And even is that our place right now? Like, what is more important? What's the harm reduction piece to this? I feel like I'm rambling, but like, the questions I'm trying to get at here.
I feel like it could be a both and. Why can't women and men have their own space, right? As long as it's not oppositional to each other, then it should be fine. And I think, should men decide they want to find a refuge here, I think we make space for that. But somewhere off to the side, right? Maybe they don't be invited into our into our main meetings, right? But maybe if they have some space here, because we don't want to be exclusionists. But I do think it's important that we do have our own space and we cultivate that. But should men need a refuge, I think we shouldn't turn that away either. And I also think if we think about, I think it's not a question of women across the scope, right? Across the spectrum. I think that's fine. But we're talking about cis men or folks that identify as men that may want to come into this space. Then I think, that's a different conversation. But I do think we don't turn anyone away, right? That's just not us. But I do think this is our safe space, and that's that, right?
Yeah, to be clear, the Women's Federation is very much a not men space. This panel series was open to all genders. And so bringing that larger conversation to the association groups and to our religious, from our religious professionals, we thought was really important. But it is interesting to see that for this meeting, I don't think we have any men online right now. But I think it's just a historical thing where people see Women's Federation as only for women, and most of our content is, and that's just how it is. I feel like I interrupted you, Kimberly, but maybe not.
No, you didn't interrupt me. I'm all right. This is you can be mad at me. I think I disagree with the idea that we don't turn people away. So for example, when we were doing Blue worship more regularly, Blue, Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, we really recognize and affirm that as Black sacred space. And it was my job. I was actually the person who turned people away, because we were really clear about our mission and our purpose. I didn't say white people can't find a place where they can worship, but this space was not for that. So I have a harder time saying like what all is our work to do. But some things I feel pretty clear that while it is good work to be done, it is not our work to do.
Thank you. Stephanie, I see you have your hand again.
Yeah. Well, just regarding the same subject, that was interesting. We had a women and girls council at work, and it was open to everybody, but it ended up being majority or mainly women, or they were struggling to attract men for that same reason. But the reason behind wanting men was because men need to get comfortable speaking, right? Or learning how to, I don't know, speak in those spaces as well. And um and yes, they're the that have to do the work, but when you have an environment in which they don't want to do the work, or there's no incentive, I guess, for them to do the work, then I don't know. I think that's a bit counterproductive. sometimes. Like I do think women should have a space for themselves. I'm just saying that men also need to learn to be in those spaces.
Yeah, you would break it up a little bit there, but I think that the gist of it was that the spaces need to exist and that learning how to be in those spaces is really important. Yeah, it's so I want to clarify, my decentering men question was in general, like as you use in particular, like specifically as us, you use, not Women's Federation specifically. I think that Women's Federation historically came out of the need to be a safe space for women to do the work because we were not given space to do that. And so women were seen as the worker bees, basically, and we're holding all of this institutional knowledge, but not given any institutional power. And that is the Women's Federation's history. And as we move into the work that we do now, we're still that safe space. And we are educating on a deeper level the world around us, I think. So I wanted to do a time check. We've about a little less than 15 minutes. Maybe we can take one more question. Anyone has any deep questions or comments that they must speak into this space? I see you, Kiana, today.
Oh, can I go?
Go.
You all have alluded to this a little bit, but something I think that we don't always talk about is same gender violence, gender violence. And so because we don't always have language to talk about it, because we think it doesn't happen, I think it also means that we don't always recognize folks who are survivors in our communities. And we don't always talk about, so I guess I just wanted to throw that in the ether to say, one of the ways that we can decenter men in our conversation is to remember that same-sex violence happens instead of having the conversation assume that it's male partners and female partners. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that decentering happens even in that shift of language, and recognizing who can be violent towards whom has nothing to do with gender.
Thank you. That is always a good thing for us to remember. I'm going to give our three panelists a moment to say any last words, and then I'll put up our announcements for the rest of our evening, unless that is Kiana Janae re-raising her hand. I think that's probably not.
I just want to say that I agree with Kiana Dene. And that's the thing, right, with the Women's Federation, right, is how do you address intimate partner violence within ministry? You know, it's happened. I know when I was in Philadelphia, there was an incident that happened in the state of Pennsylvania regarding young people and possibly intimate partner. And so, you know, there are things there, right? And we hope that the folks won't, you know, necessarily be in fellowship, but should they make it, right? And this happened in their past and they happen to share, what happens then? So that's a thing. But you know, I wholeheartedly agree with Kiana Dene that it's not male on female, that sometimes it's male on male, sometimes it's female on female. Either way, none of it is okay.
So just to be clear, this is last thoughts, Antoinette, that you're asking for. My last thought is I worked with a wonderful trainer once whose name is Beth Zemsky, and Beth talked about how whenever you're in a particular space with a mixed group of people, the identity that is most under pressure is the one that you're going to most strongly identify with. So like if you are at this conference about white people and doing white supremacy that she was leading, she was like, you are all going to feel extremely white today because we are talking about race, right? And so for example, when I am a woman in male dominated spaces, that is absolutely clear to me. And the ways that that shows up are just like absolutely in front of my eyes. What I look forward to us evolving into as we find more and more spaces that are less dominated by cis men in Unitarian Universalism. My own experience is that when I started, shifted from dating cis men to dating masculine people, that my own experience identifying really strongly as a woman shifted. Like my primary identity most of the time right now is around being a femme. And it's so fascinating. I'm not going to go down that particular rabbit hole, but like, I am really grateful for Women's Fed holding the line that you all have held, especially for women within this like very power dominated by men culture of Unitarian Universalism for so long. And I am excited for the ways in which having less pressure, because there are more women in power in various places, because there are more spaces that are not dominated by men. Not all of them, we still got work to do, but I'm excited for the ways in which we can, when the pressure is not entirely on like cis woman socialized as woman as the thing, how we can nuance that and expand that. And I'm really grateful for being invited into a conversation that's helping us to start to tease those things out.
I don't have any great final thoughts. I'm grateful that the space exists for continued conversation.
We are so appreciative of all of you for being with us and for having this conversation with us publicly, because nothing changes in a vacuum. And so being able to bring this out from our perspectives, from your perspectives, is actually what makes the larger change in our communities. And so we really appreciate that. I'm going to ask Candace to share her screen one last time. And give some final announcements. Our next gathering is November 5th, and it is our November monthly reads. On the first Sunday of each month, we have a monthly reads where we either choose a book or an article. And so this month will be an article, we switch off to give people a chance to actually read a full book. We also have our monthly community gatherings, which is the third Thursday. You're able to sign up for our newsletter if you haven't done so, or join our online community space. I'm going to go into my notes because the thing I did not add to this document is that we also host Black Women of the Chalice, and the next date for Black Women of the Chalice is November 9th. And so that is open to Black female and femme seminarian students. And you can find all of this information on our website under events. And so if you aren't able to grab it here, uuwf.org has all of our information. Next slide. Our November monthly read is the Berry Street essay by the Reverend Cecilia Kingman. This was suggested to us by Reverend Kimberly, and you can find on our website the link to take you to this page. We can also drop this link in the chat. And for December, we are reading Braiding Sweetgrass. we suggest that you, if you buy these books, to buy them from Bookshop instead of from Amazon, because then that supports a local bookstore. And also, all of this is on our website. And Last Thoughts by Rebecca A. Edmondson Lang. If you lit a chalice earlier, it's a great time to have it now. Mindful of our highest aspirations, bound by common faith and purpose, and yet beginning with ourselves as we are, let us take one more step together in our unending quest for dignity, justice, and love. Amen. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us this evening. It is always a delight to see you. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists who spent this time with us. You can always reach out to us with any questions or comments. All of that information is on our website. I'm Antoinette. Candace is also available for any questions or comments, and we appreciate you and all that you do. So thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you all for have a good night. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Thank you all. Appreciate it.